I first thought of the concept of hybridization when I tried to understand how people who lack power and authority can actually enter a negotiation and make demands which combine or mix up or destabilize the assumptions of power on which they have been, which they're asked invited to converse. So I think post-colonial studies is nothing other than thinking about the moment of enlightenment in relation to colonization, thinking about the construction of nation and civil society in the West while Western powers were involved in creating colonies in what we now call the Global South. Of course, that's not what it was called in those days. So post-colonial studies is about the connections between things that we have often not put together, to say that the Enlightenment also had its origins in empire, that Bentham's notion of the panopticon was first tried out in India, that John Stuart Mill, whose word on liberty is accepted everywhere in the world, says that I am a democrat in my own country, a proponent of liberalism, and a despot in somebody else's country as a member of a colonial power, as the subject of a colonial power. So John Stuart Mill's paradox, I am a democrat in my country and a despot in somebody else's country, gives you in brief the whole story about post-colonial studies. How do we think about democracy and despotism coexisting in different parts of the world, but at the same time? And what are the lessons we learn from there? And of course, this issue is one that bedevils all of modernity. Slavery, after all, was considered to be an economically advanced modern concept of dealing with questions of trade and production. Empire, nobody said imperialism or empire was unjust. Initially, the justification for it was that it would modernize and Christianize many countries that were actually being ruled upon by Oriental despots. So really, post-colonial studies is about the paradoxes of modernity and the contradictions of the Enlightenment, which are very much with us here today. If you think about the invasion of many countries in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and so on, I don't intend putting them in a historical context which you know, but many of these Middle Eastern interventions by Anglo-American and other powers and European powers was in the name of spreading democracy, of spreading civil society. So the old paradoxes of empire and the growth of the nation exist today in relation to interventions in countries based on the new notion of global progress. Well, I have a problem with the term post-colonial when it is narrowly used for disciplinary curricular purposes. When people want not to explore its wider connotations and want to turn it into some kind of codified canonical knowledge, because as I say, the relevance of the post-colonial movement of thought is about modernity, the concept of modernity in general. It's about the notion of the Enlightenment and how do we rethink the Enlightenment now, and what are the lineages, what are the inheritances of these powers. And don't forget that the Enlightenment, as I said earlier, or liberalism, are as much ideologies bred in the colonies as they are in the urban metropolitan centers. So I only have a problem with people who see it in a narrow disciplinary sense. Current day forms of the oppression of people's global inequality have to be defined better than calling them simply colonial. Because we don't, I mean, there are elements of colonization, the great inheritances of racism, for instance, that are used now in thinking about other cultures and other countries. But we don't strictly have a colonial form of governance at the global level. We have more forms of ethnic or populist nationalism or tribal nationalism across the world. You think about India, then you have that concept of tribal nationalism against where the Muslims are seen as the enemy within. You go to the United States, you have a majoritarian view which is largely white, Anglo-Saxon, and who are the enemies there? The enemies are the dissident intellectuals, the enemies are the Democrats, the enemies are the Mexicans, the enemies are the migrants. In Britain around Brexit, same sort of issue. We want to claim back our country. I use the word tribal nationalism now as a global phenomenon. Venezuela, Turkey, India, Britain, United States, Hungary, Poland. And what is tribal nationalism? Tribal nationalism consists of two things. One, large, powerful men who play on a kind of tyrannical charisma, to represent the majority and the majority's rights. And who are the enemies? The enemies are those minorities who threaten the majority. So tribal nationalism is continually saying to the majority, you are being threatened. You've got to claim your country back. Make America great again, which is like saying make America hate again. The fact that I'm using the term tribal nationalism today, it does make me think of its not necessarily cyclical history, but its iterative history, because the term actually comes from Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, describing the interwar period, where you had many nations coming apart, large-scale migration, minority treaties being written, and there you began to have, as she put it, a kind of tribal nationalist perspective. So the fact that today in 2018, we're talking about a phenomenon that Hannah Arendt identified when she was writing in the 50s about a period which was in the interwar period, say 1914, 1918, and she was using it in the 50s to describe what happened also in Europe near the Second World War. So how many iterations do you have? You have the interwar period of tribal nationalism, you have the post-Second World War, and indeed the construction during the Second World War of race during the Holocaust, and then you have Hannah Arendt picturing and writing about it in the term in the 50s, and now I'm using it again in 2018. So I'm not saying these are cyclical things. They don't start from the same place, go around and end in the same place, but they are iterative movements. The second question is, why are they always repressed? Are these things somehow repressed? And does democracy or democratic discourse produce a kind of pretty cover which actually hides these things? I don't think that is the case. I think that each time you have these forms of populism, there are certain populist nationalism or tribalism, they have certain elements in common and different elements. So element in common with our own time is the fact that whatever the economic crises are, whatever the political crises are, there are a group of people, largely national minorities, sexual minorities, migrants and refugees, people who are marked by the brush of race, who become the visible symptoms of the problem. They become the visible thing. So that is something that the iteration has in common. The difference, of course, is that now we have a new technologies of connectivity. Now we have a whole sense of what a globally networked world is, with all its asymmetries and inequalities. That economic structure is new. So you have an earlier kind of a recognizable mindset or political vision of tribal nationalism, now intersected with a new set of global economic and political arrangements. And I think that's the way to look at this issue.